This is the beginning of the construction of the first guest house at Mayapur. That was what you call the Lotus Building. It was designed in Calcutta by an architect named Mr. Gujarati who lived on the other side of the Pukur from Albert Road. He designed that nice building and showed it to Prabhupada, and he said, yes, this is a nice building. He said, build it. And this man, Mr. Gujarati, he had lines in his forehead. Prabhupada said, oh, he said, you have natural tilak. It's a very good sign. And we were still living up front in the straw house. We lived up in that straw house for a long time, even when the deities were in this temple on the ground floor. That would be the summer, because that's Kal Baishak season with those big cyclones. It would be so hot, and then these huge black clouds would come up, and then it would just be this heavy downpour, and then you'd have some, freshness for a few days.
When Prabhupada came to Amsterdam, that was the time I met him the first time. And so Prabhupada just came out of immigration and he saw me and he waved. And it was very ecstatic. I fell to the ground, paid my obeisances, and I laughed and I cried and I had so many emotions at the same time, which was extraordinary. Normally you either laugh or you either cry, but you don't have these emotions at the same time. Then he came to the temple and he gave a lecture. And the amazing thing of the lecture was, prior to that I could not understand Prabhupada's broad Indian dialect at all, particularly since English is not my first language. But the amazing thing was that as soon as he started talking, I could understand every single word, which was quite remarkable. I couldn't believe it. I went later, put on a tape, and I listened to it, and there it was. I understood every single word. It was kind of a miracle.
It was held in the late summer, of course, in August, and many non-devotees came, many young people, students. So just the scope of it, the dimension, and the number of devotees, number of non-devotees, it was sort of like a landmark event. Everyone that was there felt it to be so, and even Prabhupada, that something new and greater was occurring.
Srila Prabhupada was to come to New Vrindavan to conduct what he entitled the Bhagavad Dharma Discourses. He was going to speak from Srimad Bhagavatam for 7 days. The devotees at New Vrindavan, under the guidance of Kirtanananda Maharaj, were very, very enthusiastic to prepare the community for his arrival. They worked hard cutting down trees to construct a big pandal on the top of a mountain, the highest mountain of the area. That was to be the place where Srila Prabhupada would speak. Also, the devotees painted and renovated the house that Prabhupada was going to stay in, did so much landscaping, and especially they were working on building a brand new temple for Sri Sri Radha Vrindavan Chandra, which was to be inaugurated on the night of Janmashtami by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada drove in a black Lincoln Continental into the New Vrindavan property. There was ecstatic kirtan as devotees welcomed him.
One thing that really made an impression on me at that festival was the loving concern by the sannyasis and senior disciples of Srila Prabhupada for all of us, preaching to us lovingly. We all sat together and ate prasadam. You could walk up to anyone and ask a question, and they would take the time to answer you and give you association. The feeling that we were a family, and there was Srila Prabhupada. He was our father. We all felt sheltered. We all felt protected. It was like a surges of energy and rededication. We all went back to our temples completely refreshed and rejuvenated and ready for whatever austerities we had to perform.
Devotees with very, very deep enthusiasm stood and sat all around him very closely as he spoke his welcoming address, thanking the devotees for their hard work, their efforts, and giving a basic message of Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada, through his words and through his smile, while sitting there on that Vyasasan under a tree at Bahulaban, satisfied everyone's hearts. All of the hard work and intensive labor that was offered by the devotees over the previous several months was completely fulfilled. It all bore fruit when Srila Prabhupada smiled upon us and expressed his satisfaction to be with us at New Vrindavan again.
Cooking for the deities and doing the artiks. That was my service. So one time Srila Prabhupada was there when I did the artik. I had a wonderful realization. I turned around, I was dirty because I'd been cooking all day, and then they pushed me onto the altar. And I was totally embarrassed, but I turned around to offer incense to Srila Prabhupada, and I realized that he was always there on the Vyasa sign, that it was absolutely no different. And I still feel like that he's present, even though it would be nice to be able to see him more clearly. And so he was staying in the small house at Madhavan, and I was standing outside and he came out. And I suspect he came out to pass urine, which I realized years later, but I didn't know it at the time, and I was just standing there. And he came out, and I didn't pay obeisances. I couldn't say anything. I just stood there like a deer in the headlights of a car and was totally terrified. But it was a wonderful thing because he smiled, he was so gracious. He smiled and made me feel so at ease and not like I had done something stupid or that I was, somehow lacking. That he was so kind. He just stood there with me for a while, and then he smiled and turned around and went back in the building. I mean, he's always been kind to me like that because I'm very shy and, I don't ever put myself forward. So he would put himself out for me. I had experiences like that with him where he would reassure me. That's what I felt like.
Devotees from New York and various other centers brought van loads of boga for the festival. And there was a kitchen set up right on the top of the mountain in the most primitive conditions with oil barrels. They made stoves, and many dozens and dozens of devotees volunteered cutting vegetables, cooking with smoke bellowing up into people's eyes. But it was such a beautiful sight to seeing devotees from all over America working together in these very primitive forests of New Vrindavan, preparing prasad for Srila Prabhupada's Vyas Puja feast.
And one time Prabhupada was sitting taking a massage, and then right in front of Prabhupada, these two little kittens were wrestling. And they actually rolled right onto Prabhupada's lap. And so among the various zealous misconceptions that plagued us in our early days, one that we had is that, animals were so contaminated that it's horrible to even touch them. I was sort of appalled that these two kittens, they were cute, but they just rolled right onto Prabhupada's lap. And I was thinking, oh my God, an animal touched Prabhupada. But to my surprise, Prabhupada just started petting them. And Prabhupada said two things. He said, look, even here there is love. And what I immediately understood from that was that our original love for Krishna is so strong that even in the body of an animal or a cat, it still manifests in some way. And then Prabhupada said, if I put my head in your lap and you cut my throat, that is the greatest sin. He said the greatest sin is that if someone trusts you and takes shelter of you and then you betray them and cause them harm. It can be parents toward a child, it can be a man protecting a woman. Any situation where someone has sincerely trusted us and depends on us and then we betray them.
This was such a unique altar arrangement here because they had Radha Damodar in the center, Jagannath on the side, and Prabhupada on the left. You know, used to having the picture of Prabhupada on the left. We had Prabhupada in person on the left, next to the deities. I'd never seen that before, that you had an altar where Prabhupada was sitting next to the deities in person. So that was real special. And then I remember after the Vyasa Puja ceremony, it was time for the feast. They didn't close the curtains on the altar. I don't remember ever taking feast where they didn't close the curtains on the altar. So this whole sequence of events, and then just looking around at that whole hillside, it was a panoramic scene of, you know, buses and vans and tents and just devotees and cows all over the meadows. And it was just like a chapter of Krishna book come to life. Now, I think it was the same day, and I was down at the barn, and I was, you know, watching the Volkswagen go up the hillside, and the cows were all over that hillside, and they were decorated just like it's described in Krishna book with, you know, patterns made from different minerals, all different colors and different patterns. And when Prabhupada looked out of the Volkswagen, he smiled like, you know, I've never seen him smile except in that picture when in the Lilamrita when Bridge stood up for the first time. He's just beaming, as Sally Agarwal described it, that oceanic smile. When Prabhupada looked out at the cows, decorated like that, and he smiled like that. That little episode, it's just like one, you know, remembrance of how sweet the whole occasion was.
And a devotee asked Prabhupada, what does it mean to have love for the spiritual master? What does love of the guru mean? And so I was thinking, Prabhupada would say, you have all these feelings in your heart, and you know, feel this and you feel that, and that's what I was expecting to hear. And Prabhupada said, love for the guru means you have taken initiation. You have made vow to the spiritual master and taken fire sacrifice. You keep your vow. That is love. And when I heard that, I said, you know, again, that was one of those statements that Prabhupada would make where all the devotees, we were just taken completely by surprise, you know, at Prabhupada's definition of love. That it was not a feeling at all, but keeping our vow that we made to him when we got initiated. And that is how we show whether we really have love or not.
The next day was Vyasa Puja, and Srila Prabhupada, being very sensitive to the time, place, and circumstance, gave this wonderful Vyasa Puja address to describe the spiritual master and why the spiritual master was being offered so much honor and homage on this day, because after all there were many people there, scholars and journalists, etc., who were not familiar with this etiquette. So Srila Prabhupada said, Krishna is very big. He's a very big person. And Prabhupada said, just like in this material world, if you want to please or even see a big man, it is very difficult to do. He often used Ford and Rockefeller. So he said, just like Mr. Ford, if you want to please Mr. Ford, it's very hard, or even to see him, it's very hard. But if you happen to see Mr. Ford walking his dog, and you give Mr. Ford's dog a 2-cent lozenge, Prabhupada used the word lozenge, then Mr. Ford is very easily pleased. So Prabhupada said, I'm the dog of God. It is very difficult to approach Krishna, but if you simply please his dog, Krishna will be pleased.
And the day of Prabhupada's arrival, they needed volunteers to fix up the house where Prabhupada was staying. And I went up to help. There was, of course, a frenzy of activity, just as there always is, just before Prabhupada comes in any temple. And it was just an amazing sight to behold. And finally, Prabhupada arrives. And all of the sannyasis come with him. And there's about 8 or 10 sannyasis, and they all file into the house. There's a few devotees hovering by the door, and Prabhupada sees us over there by the door, and everybody else is inside the house, the big guns in the movement, so to speak. And Prabhupada motions that we should also come inside. And so the devotees are outside the door. They're sitting just on the front row, right in front of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada's talking about developing New Vrindavan. One thing I remember he said is that New Vrindavan is non-different than Vrindavan in India. And that he also mentioned that Tulsi is the spiritual barometer for a temple. And then just out of nowhere, he looks right at me and he asks, "Are you trying to understand the philosophy?" So I was so dumbfounded that the Prabhupada was talking to me, I couldn't even say a word. I was just totally in a state of shock. But what I did appreciate is the way Prabhupada phrased that question, "Are you trying to understand the philosophy?" That if someone just makes an endeavor to understand, that's sufficient. Prabhupada would be pleased just by somebody making an endeavor to try to understand. Whether they understand or not, that's another matter, but just to try to understand the philosophy.
Bhardaraj was leading, and after the kirtan started getting a little more lively, Vishnu Jan Maharaj took over the lead. Vishnu Jan kept kind of lovingly singing the Maha Mantra. All the devotees were starting to rock side to side. And then Srila Prabhupada, he closed his eyes and he was starting to hit the kartals together with more and more force. At one point, which seemed to be the perfect crescendo of the chanting of Vishnu Jan, everyone was shocked when Srila Prabhupada interrupted Vishnu Jan and took over the kirtan. That had not been seen before. Prabhupada seemed to be in such an ecstatic mood that he had no choice but to take over the kirtan. And at that moment, everyone went absolutely mad. There was a rush toward the stage, and I was right in front of Prabhupada, and we were kind of crushed into the stage, and everyone's arms, it looked like 1,000 arms were outstretched to Srila Prabhupada. People started to cry. Srila Prabhupada's chanting was so beautiful. It's almost like the sky opened up, love of God came down, and it poured over all of us. Because at one point, they were crying so much that they just started to whimper and gasp. I've never been to a kirtan like that before in my life, never since. And I think I cried for about an hour after that.
The day wore on and we were fasting and chanting, and then nighttime fell, and the midnight arti. And after fasting and chanting, everybody's ready to break fast. But Srila Prabhupada has the devotees open up Krishna book, because now he wants to hear about Krishna. It's the appearance of Lord Krishna. So Prabhupada sits up straight and his eyes are open and he's all ready to hear, and we're all ready to eat, basically. So Krishna's pastimes are being read. Now it's 12:30, 1:45, 1 o'clock.
And everyone in the room, except for Prabhupada, is gradually being overcome by the forces of sleep. And we finished the first chapter, and then it continued into the second chapter and the prayers by the demigods for Lord Krishna in the womb, fairly weighty philosophical topics. And you would see these dandas nodding like divining rods, or like crossed swords crossing in the aisle, as the sannyasis bearing them would gradually be falling asleep. And then the rods would again split apart from one another as the sannyasis would jerk themselves awake, and then the rods would gradually descend again as the devotees holding them, descended towards sleep.
But Prabhupada was very staunch. He was there listening very intently. And at one point, I remember looking around the room, and everyone in the room was asleep except for Prabhupada at one point. It was really incredible. I was watching Prabhupada very carefully to see if he was going to fall asleep. And at one point, Prabhupada looked like he was starting to nod. And he just leaned forward ever so slightly, and immediately caught himself and sat back up straight. And with his right hand, he made a chopping motion, like, no, I won't fall asleep. And from that moment on, he was sitting there listening in rapt attention.
Then suddenly, it's pitch black. The power had gone out. So I was thinking, what is Srila Prabhupada's expression going to be when the lights come back on? Is he going to be upset? What is he thinking about? It seemed like a very long time that the power was off. And when the lights came back on, Prabhupada had this huge ear-to-ear grin on his face. And the words that he said were, "So now, Krishna is sitting on the lap of Mother Yasoda. I think you are all tired, so we can stop here." And all the devotees started roaring.
I remember Gayatri and several other of ISKCON's best bakers spending several days to cook a gigantic cake for Srila Prabhupada's Vyas Puja. It was the most enormous cake I ever saw in my entire life. And they were cooking everything on this very, very simple makeshift wood oven. The fuel was wood, and they made the oven out of some sort of big cans, barrels. And they would just make a little piece at a time, a little piece at a time, and they just, as the days went on, they were stacking it up, and it ended up a huge, glorious, incredible cake. They brought it all the way up on the hill. Many devotees had to carry it, and then they offered to Srila Prabhupada. And as Srila Prabhupada was eating it, it became prasad. So within moments, devotees gathered around the cake for remnants, and they practically dove into that cake. Within a matter of seconds, this gigantic cake disappeared.
This was a really glorious return for him to Vrindavan. He just really enjoyed his disciples being there. And Prabhupada was really excited about going back there. I became his servant like a month before. And he had it planned out.